Last week, I mentioned that back in 2012, which is now 12 years ago, I was invited by Malyon College, the Baptist Theological College, to help them in a project that was just for one day a week to think about what it would mean to integrate our faith with our daily work. What did it mean to be a Christian, a follower of Jesus, if you were a plumber or a real estate agent, or better say a farmer for Jim, or a nurse or a prison officer, or even a teacher or a doctor, who knows? And when I've asked that question from time to time about what it means, after people initially say, "Oh, I've never really thought about it," which is quite common, I usually get one of two answers, which I'm going to have to try and put up on the screen here for you. It's up there? Oh, good, I can see it there. Yeah. I usually get one of two answers. The first option is people say, "Well, look, I don't steal the company biros." Now, what they mean by that is, of course, I do the right thing. I keep the rules. I'm a good colleague, good friend in the workplace, okay? Or the second one, from the really keen types, somehow they manage to get Jesus into every conversation during the day. I used to know a painter friend, and he'd tell me that he'd be painting with someone and he'd say, "You know how clean and new this building looks? Jesus can make you clean and new if you come to him." And so somehow everything gets turned to Jesus. Well, most of us aren't real good at crowbarring Jesus into every conversation. We're not real comfortable about turning a discussion where we're talking about the weather or last night's footy results somehow to Jesus. So we tend to opt for option number one. We just don't steal the company biros. I hope you know what I mean by that. We just do the right thing. We just keep our head down. So over these next 3 Sundays, I want to, unpack a bigger picture for you, if I can, of what it might look like to follow Jesus on what we're calling our front lines. Now, you'll remember, this is where we're heading. So this week, I want to talk to you about this framework, the 6 M's, comes from a book called Fruitfulness on the Front Line by a guy called Mark Green. And he says these are the things that we can do. We can make good work. We can model godly character. We'll talk about those this week. Minister love and grace and mould culture. Be a mouthpiece for truth and justice, and a messenger for the gospel. And so that's where we're sort of heading over these next few weeks. I want to sort of emphasise right at the start that this is not some sort of to-do list for you, a list of do's and don'ts, all right? So that you head out of here thinking, "Oh, crikey, I've got to do this and that and that, and I've got to remember them for a start." I don't want you to feel that way. I'd rather want you to see these as lenses, ways in which you can see what God is already doing in and through you in the places that he's put you, wherever your front line happens to be. It's about sort of reorienting our thinking into the possibilities and opportunities that are already there. Sometimes I talked about them as just little tiny 1-degree shifts. Not a massive change, but to help us to think about how in our ordinary everyday lives, places where God's already put us, we might be more fruitful for him. Now, just a bit of quick revision, because I know some of you weren't here last week, and I'm a teacher, so you have to do some revision. Front lines. So when I say the word front line, this is what I mean. It's the place where you spend a lot of your time, where you meet people who don't know Jesus. It's a place where God has put you, called you, and there's lots of possibilities and potential there. And I got you to think last week about what your front lines are. I'm hoping that's something that you might have continued to think about. For some of you, it might be a workplace. For some of you, it might be your neighbourhood, your family. It might be a club that you're involved in. It might be the shopping centre that you go to. All of those sorts of things are possibilities. Might be your hairdresser. I've just been. I thought I'd mention that. I remember walking down Margaret Street one day, and I was walking across the road, and I have an American friend called Debbie. She's been here for a number of years, but she's still very American. And as she's on the other side of Margaret Street, and I'm on one side, and she calls out to me as she's heading off, "I'm on my front line, Murray." And what she meant by that was she was heading off to catch up with a friend for a cup of coffee and have a chat about life and do life together. And that was one of her front lines. I don't like coffee, so that's not my front line. So have a little bit of a think and be thinking about as we progress. What's the place where you spend a lot of time and there are people there who don't know Jesus, who you might want to influence? Okay, let's move on. The first thing I want to do, though, is just to make sure we're on the same page, because I'm going to be mentioning the idea of work a few times. And otherwise, quite a few of you just looking around might be thinking, well, I don't do any work, so it doesn't impact me, so I'll just have a nod off for a while. And those chairs are very conducive to nodding off, so just hang in there, all right? I want to change your mind about work is. When we think about work, a couple of things come to mind. First of all, it's something we do, so we get paid and we can put food on the table, and that's absolutely fine. The second thing sometimes we think about is it's something to avoid if at all possible. So people say things like this: I owe, so off to work I go. Or this one: I haven't been this excited about Friday since last Friday. And some of you may not be in a workplace now, but you'll remember feeling like that when it got to Friday. Yes, yes. All right, this is my personal favourite. A bad day golfing is better than a good day working. So you're starting to get some idea of my passions. Okay. And look, there's a bit of truth in some of each of those. But, you know, as followers of Jesus, we actually need to do better than that, don't we? Because we easily get influenced by sayings like that, and we think about what we do in those terms rather than what the Bible tells us to do. You know, Romans 12, where Paul says that we're to be not let the world squeeze us into its own mould, J.B. Phillips' translation, but we're actually to be shaped by the gospel and what God says. And so I want to think about that a little bit this morning. So just further thinking about work. One way to think about it, work is the way we make ourselves useful to others. And so some of us do that through paid work. You know, we make things. We grow things, we sell things, we share knowledge, that sort of thing. And some of us do lots of unpaid work. I know many of you will have done that. You've done it in the past or you do it now. Stay-at-home parents looking after kids, maybe you're volunteering in something or other. Maybe you're coaching or serving on a P&C. Who knows what it could be, but you know the sort of things I mean. Some of you, just looking around, are a bit like me, heading down that retirement path, and so there's probably grandkids visiting unwell, sick friends, doing a bit of gardening. Those of you who've been retired a while will all a bit like me. You wonder how you fitted in work, paid work, when you were, because there's so much to do now. Is that right? Never a dull moment. And some of you may actually be unemployed or underemployed, and you're looking for paid work or something. So I guess what I'm trying to say is all of us have work to do, all of us, of those different varieties, and so don't nod off. But let's just turn our attention then to what the Bible says about work, and I could preach a whole series of sermons or more on what the Bible says about work, but I want to just take you to Genesis chapter 1 to 3. I could have picked a number of Bible passages this morning, Jenny, thank you, so I'm sorry I picked Daniel 1, but anyway, that'll do. I'm assuming that some of you are pretty familiar with some of these passages, so we'll skate over them pretty quickly. But Genesis 1 to 3 tells us a lot about work, I think. So the first thing it tells us is that God himself is a worker. Have you ever thought of it that way? He works at creating the cosmos and human beings. And if you read the passage carefully, you can see a lot of the things about the way God works. First of all, he creates order out of chaos, doesn't he? Some of you ladies will remember doing that when kids went to school and you got rid of your husband. You created order out of the chaos that lasted for a few hours until they all got home again. And God works with pattern and rhythm. He works for 6 days and then he has a day off. And his work creates provision. So he establishes an environment where human beings can flourish. It's perfect, but it's not yet complete. There's more work to be done. It's an unfinished project that God establishes. The other thing we see in the way that God works is it brings him great joy. Do you remember? It's very good, he says. And I don't know about you. Have you felt that way about you? I feel like that, and after I've edged the lawn with my fancy clipper thing and mowed and stand back and have the hose going, and such a good feeling. If you saw the size of my yard, it's about this big, so it's not a lot of joy, but, you know, there's a bit of joy. But I'm sure you've had that experience, okay, in your work. You've had the other as well, but we'll come to that. And as God works, he creates beauty. And we do that sometimes in our work. Those of you who are gardeners will experience that. But that can be even something as simple as, this one always amuses me, a plate of biscuits. Arranging them so they look rather... You don't just throw them on, do you? Well, I might, but that's not how my wife would do it. And God's work releases potential. The creation itself has got all these wonderful things to be explored by humans. The second thing is that we work as stewards of God's world. Genesis 2:15 says this, the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to take care of it. So just as God is a worker, we're to be workers as well. It's part of God's good design for us as human beings that we will have work to do. Some people think work is like a punishment from God, but that's not the way it's meant to be. It's part of what God has designed us to do. We're like God's caretakers. We're to look after his world. We're to explore its potential. And it's interesting that the word that is used there for work is exactly the same word as we use for worship. So when we work, we're worshipping. A friend of mine has written a couple of books called Workship. She's put it together. So if you think about that on Monday, it's not off to I-O, so off to work I go. I'm going to worship God. It's workship. Okay? So we talked about this a little bit last week. So does our work matter for God? You bet it does. It's part of how he's designed us. He's interested in what we do. And we learnt from Colossians last week that whatever we do, paid, unpaid, God cares about it and what we do there. So it's not just something that worship is not just something we do here on Sunday morning, which we are doing. We say, welcome to worship. But actually, we send you out to worship from Monday to Saturday as well in the things that you're to do. And the third thing we learn, and this is a bit sad, that work is actually, I was going to say stuffed, but that's not a good word. But it's broken. It's not good. Okay? And I'm sure that you're aware of that. We know what happens next in the Garden of Eden. After this great start, Adam and Eve sort of disobey. They fail to guard and protect what they've been instructed to do. And they want to do things their own way, rather do it their way than live under God's rule and his ideas. And all of that results in separation, alienation, yeah? Alienation from God, alienation from one another, and in fact, alienation from the whole creation itself. And so, if you read Genesis 3, 7 and 19, we get this bleak picture of what happens as a result of human rebellion. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you. I should get Jim up here. You probably didn't have any thorns and thistles on your farm. Plenty, all right? And it was hard work, wasn't it, getting rid of them, okay? And you will eat the plants of the field by the sweat of your brow. You will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken, from dust you are, and to dust you will return. So it's all broken. It's all messed up. It's not as it was meant to be. And so instead of work becoming something that we enjoy, we know that it gets broken. So just think back to your situations now or when you were working earlier. There's all that office politics, office gossip. There's jealousy about who gets the top job. That could be everything from the CEO of the company to who gets to be the tuck shop convener. Sometimes that happens in churches too, I might add. There can be threats and lies and intimidation and bullying everywhere from the classroom to the boardroom to the bedroom. And on a global scale, we know there is exploitation and oppression of whole communities working in inhumane, unfair and unjust conditions. So work is messed up. In fact, it is stuffed. But at a personal level, it gets messed up too, because we tend to swing between two ways. You might want to think about your own situation now or in the past, because we can make work an idol, I-D-O-L, or we can become idle in our work. Take the first one. Some people, work becomes so all-consuming, they become workaholics. We get proud of our busyness. When somebody says to you, what have you been doing this week? We feel like we've got to say, rattle off 1,000 things that we did. We let ambition drive our relationships and the things that we do. I don't know if any of you were like that or know people were like that, where it was work, work, work all the time. And the trouble is that, like any idol, if we make work an idol, it never meets our needs. It never meets our expectations. I wonder how many of you have heard of people who get to the top, they reach their goal, and then they wonder, what's the point? Or they say things like, I wish I'd spent more time often with my kids or my family, but work dominated. I'm not trying to do a guilt trip here, just saying that's what can happen when we make work an idol. But we can also be idle, IDLE, in our work. We do just enough to get by. Anything from a half-baked report to a half-baked roast meal. We get slack or cynical in our approach to work, and we do just enough. We're not a good employee or whatever it is. It doesn't have to be a paid work, but any sort of situation, we can be quite idle. I love my comforts. My kids reckon that when I die, they'll come round and find me in the armchair, a skeleton with a remote in each hand, trying to work out how to get the TV going. Thank goodness I'm married. All right. So that's a bit of a background about what the Bible says about work. So I want to turn our attention now back to that 6M framework to give you a bit of a bigger picture about what it might look like to be fruitful on our front lines as we make good work and we model godly character. And to do that, I want to actually briefly take you to my Bible hero, Daniel. I wonder if you've ever thought of Daniel as a public servant. I wonder if you ever thought about the fact that the Bible devotes a whole book to the life of a worker. Not just any worker, but a government worker. That's an oxymoron for some of you, I know, but we'll hang with it. It's not a priest. It's not a prophet. It's not from a king. This is a book about a public servant, a government worker. Can you believe that in the Bible? Weird. Anyway. Now, I imagine that some of you have been public servants, and we don't always get good press, do we? Can you put who's been a public servant? Who's worked for the government? Or excellent, thank you. Well, bless you. I don't know if I should tell this story, but I will anyway. I was about to go and join. I finished at being principal at Toowoomba State High School, and the next week I was starting at Toowoomba Regional Council. And my role was some fancy title, Director of Corporate Services. And I don't know, you know Ken Scanlon from TCBC? Ken Scanlon came up to me on Sunday morning and says to me, knowing that I was starting at the council next Monday, so you're off to breastfeed a shovel tomorrow, are you? I had to think a few times what he meant by that, and if you're not sure, ask people later. So that was his view. How many public servants does it take to change a light bulb? 45, one to change the bulb, and 44 to do the paperwork. Anyway, all right. So these first 6 chapters, and I'm sort of assuming this morning that you're a bit familiar with them, are this rich source of wisdom, I think, and insight into what working life can be like. And I want to sort of summarise that as we go. But I think that there are 2 things that Daniel knows and things that Daniel does that I want you to maybe take away this morning. The first thing is that Daniel knows is that he's part of God's bigger story. And we see that in those opening verses that Laurie read to us before. Did you see that? First thing that Daniel knows is that he's not in Babylon by accident. It's not Nebuchadnezzar that put him there. It's God. See it? In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, Judah, and I just say wheelbarrow if you can't understand a word, all right? So that's just a tip. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, besieged it, and the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, or wheelbarrow, king of Judah, into his hand. Daniel is in Babylon, not because of Nebuchadnezzar, because that's where God has placed him. How about that? That'd be hard to understand, wouldn't it? And they know this was coming because that's what Jeremiah the prophet had said would happen because of Israel's disobedience. But I've got no doubt that this is how they felt in Babylon. Yahweh, we're here with the wrong sort of people. They're heathens, they're pagans. And it's the wrong time. We're budding young men. We should be growing up in the palace or in the temple of Jerusalem. It's the wrong place. And they're asking us to do all sorts of wrong things. Did you remember that from the reading? 3 years they were indoctrinated in Babylonian religion, language and culture. And we have to eat this foreign muck. Food. Sorry. All right? That is not what bright, handsome, young, sharp Hebrew boys are supposed to be doing. They should be in Jerusalem, but they're in Babylon. Why are we here, God? It's not fair. This is not right. We're the top of the class. We should be getting better than this. This is not their front line of choice. And I wonder if for some of you can think back in your life to times when you were in places and you thought, God, why have you put me here? This is not where I want to be. These are not the people I want to be with. They ask me to do terrible things sometimes, or there's pressure on me to break the rule, whatever it happens to be. Why have you put me here? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, Daniel knows that his job is to seek the welfare of Babylon. He is actually to work at making Babylon a better place. Now that is fairly weird, isn't it? Why wasn't he there to undermine Nebuchadnezzar, to put bombs in? I don't know what he did, but anyway. That's not what he's there for. I don't know if Daniel ever met the prophet Jeremiah, but he would have known about a letter that Jeremiah sent to the exiles in Babylon. Just a bit of background. There was a false prophet called Hananiah. You can read this in Jeremiah 28. And he'd been running around telling the Israelites that there was no need to panic. It'll all be over soon, 2 years at the most, and then we can bring back all the stuff and put it in the temple, and the king's son will return, and Babylon's days are numbered, so don't panic, chin up, it's all going to be okay. It's a lovely message. It's the message people wanted to hear, wasn't it? But Jeremiah knows better. And he knows that God's people are going to be in Babylon. Do you remember how long it was going to be for? 70 years. That's a long time. That's as long as I've been alive, come to think of it. So it's a very long time. He knows that it'll be 70 years before they get to go back to Jerusalem. So what does Jeremiah do? He sends them a letter with some advice. And you can read it in Jeremiah 29. I've got just a few verses from it. They're probably fairly familiar to you. This is Jeremiah. He says to them, listen, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce, take wives and have sons and daughters, take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease, but seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord for its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. I don't know about you if you've read those verses before, but that is startling stuff. Seek the welfare. Seek the well-being, the shalom, the peace and prosperity of the pagan city that I've placed you in. Pray for them. Pray for your enemies. Startling. We usually associate that with Jesus, but that's what Jeremiah is saying. The Apostle Peter wrote something very similar to Christians who were in Asia Minor hundreds of years later. He wrote this to them. Dear friends, he said, I urge you as foreigners and exiles, note that word exiles, so Peter is riffing off this idea back in Jeremiah, abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul, live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. So whether or not you're a public servant, whatever you do, paid, unpaid, the advice from Jeremiah and Peter should be a great encouragement to us, I think, and guide us in what we do day to day in our very ordinary lives. We are all of us part of God's bigger story. We're all of us part of God's mission and what he's doing in the world. Each one of us is called to work for, to pray for the well-being, the peace and prosperity of Highfields, and can I add Toowoomba in there? Is that all right? Thank you, Jim. Wherever God has placed us, from a classroom or a hospital or a retirement village, a factory, a shopping centre, our family, our friends, we're to pray and work for their welfare and their well-being. Whatever you do, wherever you are, we're part of God's mission to reconcile all things to himself, to make everything right, as Paul says in Colossians chapter 1. And I think that knowing that makes all the difference to the way that Daniel lives his life out in Babylon, because he does these two things that I've talked about. He wants to model godly character and make good work, those first two M's that I want to just very quickly have a look at today. That was the introduction. It's okay, don't panic, we'll get there. Okay. So I'm assuming that most of you know those stories from Daniel 1 to 6. You know, all that stuff we read about this morning, the special diets, but there's also weird dreams, fiery furnaces, strange writings on walls. Do you remember all this? Am I bringing back all your Sunday school recollections? Not to mention escaping hungry lions. Yeah, okay. Fantastic stories. And Maureen, I'm sure you've taught many of those many times in many RE classes, for sure. Well, I want you to just sort of take off your Sunday school specs today and put on your worker specs as we think about them. So, we come to see, first of all, that he models godly character. In chapter 1, and this is going to be very quick, so apologies for if it's a bit fast, but in chapter 1, did you see there, he took a stand and maintained his purity by not eating food that had been offered to idols. I always find it interesting in that passage, and you can park this for another time. How come it's okay to do the literacy test and learn the language, but it's not okay to eat the food? Dunno. But that's where Daniel and his friends decide to draw the line. If you flick over to chapter 2, that's where Daniel courageously interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And what does he say to him? He says, Nebuchadnezzar, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. Chapter 4, he tells the king that basically you're going to go bonkers and you're going to live with animals and you're going to eat grass. Can you imagine speaking this sort of to the king? Put yourself in shoes, go and pick up Prince Charles. You're going to go... No, we won't go there. And in chapter 5, if you read it, it looks like now, a few kings down the way, Daniel is on the outer. He's been banished. There's a new king, Belshazzar, on the throne, not the phone. And Daniel is yesterday's hero. He may be enjoying a redundancy package, I don't know, but he's on the outer. And when no one else can make sense of this strange writing on the wall, do you remember the stories? The queen reminds you, there's a bloke called Daniel. He might be able to help. And there's no hint in the text that Daniel is somehow bitter because he's been forgotten, or that he's yesterday's hero. I wonder how we go when our achievements and our contributions are no longer remembered or recognised. I wonder if our egos get bruised a bit when we get overlooked and we don't get the attention that we think we deserve. Well, not Daniel. The thing is, and you might want to think about this point during the week, where is Daniel learning godly character? He's not learning it in the temple in Jerusalem. He's learning it in the palace of Babylon. And I don't want to overstate it, but I actually think, I want to suggest to you this morning that it's when we're scattered that we really learn stuff. We learn the theory here together. Yes, we do bump shoulders and we learn stuff here. And I think most of the important stuff that I've learned has been when I've been on my front line. And I've learnt what it means to exercise godly character there and to model that in the way that I interact with people. I think one of the best ways to think about godly character is the fruit of the Spirit. You'll be familiar with those. How do we respond when we've got a boss, had a few of those, who can be a bit unreasonable, overbearing? How do we respond in love? What about the daily grind of looking after an elderly parent or a partner or a disabled child? That can really sap our joy. What about if you're a sports coach and there's that parent who always wants their kid picked even though they've got two left feet? How do you learn patience there? What about your neighbours, you mightn't have them this close out here in leafy Highfields, but you know, the ones that play the loud rock music and till 3 a.m. in the morning. How can you learn peace and gentleness? What about kindness and goodness that gets stretched when, I don't know, if you've ever been in a workplace where somebody steals your decaf coffee or your Earl Grey, I don't care if they steal Earl Grey, but anyway, and your special tea bags and somebody else gets into them, make it up for yourself. What about just self-control when pornography and things like that are so easy to access these days? What about being in situations where people do not think with a Christian worldview? How can we stay faithful to Jesus? Well, Daniel, he demonstrates godly character in a very challenging front line, and I think is a wonderful example to us. But Daniel also does good work. And he does it, by my calculations, for 60 or 70 years. You can miss that in the text. But Daniel serves in Nebuchadnezzar's, or the king's palace in Babylon, for something like 60 to 70 years. And in that passage that was read to us today, the quality of work that he does so impresses his supervisor that he's actually willing to let Daniel and his mates go vegetarian, even though it's going to put his own career at risk if the experiment fails. I've been tempted to wonder what I'd do. I'd probably just tip the forbidden food into the palace pot plants, you know. But that's not what Daniel does, because he's a man of integrity and he does the right thing. And for 60 years, so that when we get to chapter 6, it's actually the quality and consistency of Daniel's life that gets him in trouble. Do you remember that story? In Daniel 6 verse 3 we read, "He had so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king," and we're up to Darius the Mede now, Labour's out, LNP's in. Change of routine, all right? That they planned to set him over that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. His 60 years track record was such that he was in line for the top job. And that gets right up the nose of those other Babylonian bureaucrats. And they set out finding ways that they can bring him down. Do you remember that? We actually read in the text there, they found no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor diligent. Godly character, good work. And in the end, it's actually the consistency of Daniel's devotional life that trips him up. So we read in verse 10 of chapter 6, "Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem." Daniel still knows what the real story's about. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he'd done before. Daniel's been doing this so long, everybody knows what he's going to do and how they can catch him out. And I think one verse, and it's the last verse in chapter 1, that summarises the quality and the diligence of Daniel's work. Mate, it's so easy to skip that verse over and it jumps out at me. "And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus." So right at the end of chapter 1, we're told that Daniel was there for all that time, being faithful. It's a lifetime of service on the front lines of the Babylonian civil service, making good work and demonstrating God's character, seeking the welfare of the city. I wonder what making good work, modelling godly character looks like on your front line this week. Martin Luther wrote this: "The Christian shoemaker does his duty not by putting little crosses on the shoes, but by making good shoes, because God is interested in good craftsmanship." Do you understand what he's saying there? Making good work, doing good things, the quality of our witness on our front lines is what sets us up to share the gospel with people. I'm sure you've all heard someone say, "So-and-so calls themselves a Christian and look what they did." Sometimes that's just not fair, but sometimes it's actually true, isn't it? Modelling godly character and doing good work gives us this platform that gives people an openness to Christian witness. So friends, go this week, live good lives, do good deeds, seek the welfare of your family, your school, your workplace, your front line, your neighbourhood, wherever it is that God's put you. And I want to just finish by reading these words of Paul from Philippians, because I think they're a wonderful way to send us out into the week. Friends, do everything readily and cheerfully. No bickering, no second guessing allowed. Go out into the world uncorrupted, a breath of fresh air in this squalid and polluted society. Provide people with a glimpse of good living and of the living God. Carry the light-giving message into the night, so I'll have good cause to be proud of you on the day that Christ returns. Blessings as you go this week to work and to worship wherever it is that God's placed you. Thanks.